Dr. Cooper,
Great to be here.
it's wonderful to have you back. What is the story going on in the Iliad? Is it truly a tragedy? Is it about the loss of princeliness when Hector dies at the end?
Yeah, the certainly a poem with deep, tragic notes,
Hmm.
at the very least. And the death of Hector, bereavement of Andromache, and the sense that the whole of this beautiful city of Troy is facing annihilation
Hmm.
on the one hand, and on the other hand, Achilles and the Hellenic, or as I guess in the poem, the Achaean warrior princes uh, facing their own conflicts and
Hmm.
their own kind of being made in the course of the poem to suffer something approaching the devastation that they are bringing down on Troy. So it seems like the tragic notes are being played on both sides of the battlefield, as it were.
Hmm. It always struck me every time I read it that it seemed that Hector was portrayed, and please forgive me if I'm not reading the text correctly, that Hector is the sole defense of Troy in a certain sense. His father is taking no part in the actual fighting. Paris is occasionally there shooting arrows, but also not taking part in the fighting. And obviously, Troy has its soldiers and Troy has its allies. But when Hector falls, there is to my reading, a sense that Troy has lost its best hope. Whereas to me, it's always seemed on the Greek side, there was this almost this round table, to borrow the Arthurian image, but it did seem like there was this circle of heroes on the Greek side, which the Trojan side couldn't quite match. Am I reading this correctly?
So you're absolutely right that the Homer does everything to make a sense that with the death of Hector, the fall of Troy is in
Okay.
as early as book 6, when in the kind of moving scene in which Hector steps inside the walls of the city, still bloody and grimy from the battle, and meets his wife and his mother and his infant son
Mm-hmm.
and also Helen,
Mm.
three women whose fates are connected with the survival of that city in
Mm.
significant ways. Um, as early as that moment, um, the poet says, well, they named Hector's child Astyanax, lord of the city, because Hector alone saved Ilion. Meaning, not only are you supposed to recognize it, reader, but actually the Trojan people themselves recognize that Hector is the hope of Troy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say there aren't other splendid warriors
Mm.
in the Trojan side. You mentioned the allies, and Sarpedon, son of Zeus, is a great warrior who accomplishes feats that are coming close to anything that any of the other heroes do. He's the first one who tears apart the Achaean wall.
Mm.
Um, and though you're also right, if you're thinking of the Achaean and the Trojans as a kind of a football team or something, the Achaean line has real depth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, where, but the Trojans have other advantages.
Mm-hmm.
They have, for one thing, this magnificent wall.
Mm.
And in a sense, in the ancient world, your wall on within your wall, you have the ordered life that is and that is friendly to your people and to your children and to your women and to your gods. And outside that wall, there's a lot of dangerous and deadly things roaming about.
Mm.
But if you hold your wall, you can protect that life. And so there's a sense then that the Trojans don't need a line of the same depth in order to prevail. And of course, we never. It's also told us by Homer fairly early in the poem that up until this point in the war, which has been going for 9 years, the Trojans have not ventured beyond their wall.
Mm.
Something happens early in the poem that emboldens the Trojans and Hector above all to go out beyond the defensible wall and risk everything on a play for a spectacular and decisive victory.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is the withdrawal of the greatest of the Greek warriors, Achilles, from the action.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the occasion for Hector to take the fire to the Greeks
Mm-hmm.
and to put the Greeks in a position where suddenly they're building their own wall.
Uh-huh.
And it's also the occasion for the Achaean line, the Greek line, to show its depth because their star player is out. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's only then that maybe the Achaeans themselves realize the depth of talent and strength and courage that exists in their army. I feel that I've lost the tragic note in my love of battle.
Right. Is the is it a little too early in the tradition of literature to apply words like comedy or tragedy to the works of Homer? Are those more distinct ideas of storytelling that really come after the works of Homer? So we shouldn't try to force the labels on what for him was perhaps not intending to be something that fit into a strict category.
Tragedy, of course, uh, in its full blown, fully articulated form, appears in 5th century.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, 5th century
Mm-hmm.
Athens,
Mm-hmm.
with Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides.
Okay.
And according to some literary critics, doesn't really appear again in its full, intense, enacted dramatic form until the Renaissance, and we can think of Shakespeare
Okay.
with Othello.
Okay. So
Hamlet
fully enacted.
here. However, the tragic, whatever was being concentrated and even in a certain way made into this kind of enacted communal civic liturgy in Athens in the tragic form, the roots of that are to be found in Homer, I think, and in the Iliad, as you suggested.
Okay. So certainly the roots. Maybe we don't want to.
So I would I feel a little bit like I don't have my feet on the ground right now simply because I don't know that we've defined our terms, tragedy
Okay.
and so on. However, my claim, which may have to be qualified or changed or retracted once we've defined terms and found out what we're really talking about. My claim would be that the Iliad is tragic. By which I mean to say it's something larger than a tragedy, but its whole um, the whole action of being moving in part by circumstances that you're born into, in part by your own half blind choices, in part by your own virtues, all these things causing you to move into an inevitable catastrophe that costs you everything and teaches you that in that everything that is being cost is more than you ever could have imagined. Um, in that kind of a structure, if that's the kind of thing I mean by tragedy, then the Iliad is that.
Mm-hmm.
Although I would argue that it's primarily the tragedy of Achilles rather than that of Troy or Hector.
Ah, okay. So help me out trying to define the terms here. So when we talk about a tragedy being a full tragedy, fully realized either in Sophocles or in the Renaissance, we're talking about a story in which the loss, the losses realized at the end of the story are also a lesson to the reader or to the main characters about a good which they once possessed, perhaps not even knowing they possessed it, and they fully recognize both the loss and the good which they used to have. Is that all in
So
there?
that recognition that you're talking about for
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle, anagnorisis, it's
Anagnorisis.
the moment at which it's not tragedy uh, until there's this moment of recognition
Mm.
by the tragic hero of a loss, devastating loss, um, of the kind of thing that one loves more than one's life. And in that moment of recognition, you see simultaneously the priceless value of what has been lost and that the loss is irrevocable and that your own actions, choices, perhaps even who and what you are causes in some way. Your person, your being, your moral being, maybe your being even deeper than your moral being is implicated in that loss.
So, in a certain way, it was inevitable that you would move in this direction.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about tragedy without talking about fate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to talk about fate without getting into uh, difficult questions that the philosophers tell me can be resolved. Difficult problems having to do with free will and responsibility at the same time, foreknowledge, fate, being within a pattern that's larger than you that is somehow giving you your meaning and giving you your being before you even were fully aware.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the experience of the paradigmatic tragic hero, Oedipus, is that the most important events of his life were set in being before he was aware. He was conceived by Laius and Jocasta, something that he had nothing to do with, really,
Mm-hmm.
except that he was the fruit of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a prophecy about the son of Laius being the one who would overthrow him. And so he was his mother. Another fateful act for his whole life. His mother exposed him on a hillside where he was found and picked up. And in fact, she exposed him and ordered that his ankles be pierced and bound together so that when he first came to himself as a child, he already had this ache
Uh-huh.
in his legs and ankles that spoke to him of those things that enter into the makeup of his being that he had no power over.
Mm.
And so
I'm different and I'm rejected in some way. Yeah. Someone wounded me.
I'm wounded. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have these mysterious wounds and I limp.
Uh-huh.
Oedipus, his name means pierced feet. So it's connected to his bound feet, pierced feet. It's connected to his identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so later on, he's a young man. He goes to the oracle at Delphi and asks about his future. And the oracle tells him, watch out, you're going to kill your father and sleep with your mother. And he thinks, well, I don't want to do that. The way maybe any of us would think. And so he's been raised in Corinth as the Prince of Corinth by the King and Queen of Corinth. So he wants to get as far from them as possible. And so he takes the road from Delphi away from Corinth and towards Thebes, his actual native place of his birth. And on the way to Thebes, he comes to a road where three streets meet. And there is this aggressive man who challenges him at the crossroad, and men attack him, and he fights back, and he kills the man in the chariot and continues down the road. As you do when you're outside the walls of the city, you've got to fight when someone fights you. And then he ends up in Thebes that just lost its king, and he is a likely young nobleman, so he marries the queen and saves them from the Sphinx, and in the meantime has killed his father and married his mother. And the first, or the kind of paradigmatic Greek tragedy, Oedipus Rex, is the story not of him doing those things or trying to avoid those things, but rather discovering that he has done them.
Mm.
He's
Discovering what it is that he has really done. Right. He knows he met a man on the road. He knows that he fought. He knows that he married this queen of Thebes, but he doesn't even really know what it is that he himself has done. Wow.
So he's discovering, he thinks he knows who he is. But he's not entirely wrong. He's the king of Thebes, but he thinks of himself as an outsider who's come in to save the city, to deliver them from the Sphinx that is destroying them by means of his wit and his courage, and his kind of outsider pluck and angle. But in fact, he is a plague on the city, as deadly and more insidious than the Sphinx, because he's not an outsider. He's the insider. He's in relation to his mother, he's the insider 2 times over in a very perverted and horrible way. And he's not only the man who stepped in to fill the empty throne, he's the man with the blood of the king on his hands, blood of his father on his hands when he went to enter his mother, and so on. So this recognition that in trying to take hold of his destiny and make something good and noble out of it, with all of his wit and pluck and ingenuity and courage, and doing the manly things a man does on the road, rising to the opportunities that fortune presents himself with, he has been, in fact, rushing into this horrific fate.
Mm.
If he hadn't asked though, would he have known? Like if he didn't go to the oracle and the oracle didn't tell him, or yeah, if he never went and never knew what the destiny was for him, would he have avoided it because he wasn't actually trying to avoid it?
I'm sure these are the
Like,
questions
yeah.
he asked himself in his
Yeah.
fevered dreams at night.
Yeah.
I ran into my fate by trying to avoid it. If I hadn't tried to find it out and tried to avoid it, would I have avoided it by not trying to?
Yeah.
Hmm. In any event,
Hmm.
one of the things that we see in Oedipus Rex, I think, is that his desire to know
Hmm.
and to understand and to inquire and to ask and to get to the bottom of what things really are actually what makes him noble and admirable. So another possibility of not asking is if the play opens, there's a plague on the city, and the people cry out to Oedipus as to their father to save them a second time. And he says, well, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll find out what's going on. I'll do whatever it takes to rid the city of its plague. And so he sends to the oracle again, asks for the cause of the malaise and the plague and the death that's haunting the city. And he finds out that, well, it's because the king's murderer is still in the city. And so he immediately devotes himself to interviewing everyone who might have known, in more than interviewing, cross-examining, threatening, demanding to find out everything that happened in relation to the death of Elias. And as this Oedipus detective story unfolds, Jocasta, who has a little bit more, his wife, but also his mother, who has a little bit more information about events at that time, begins to realize what he's going to find out. So, in other words, she already knows who and what he is, and what she's been doing, and what he's been doing. And she tries to persuade him not to ask any more questions. Your life.
But that's sort of impossible for him, right? He's given his word that he will discover the cause of the people suffering. He can't stop.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
He is committed
Mhm.
to the truth of things,
Mhm.
even at the cost of the beauty and the happiness of his life as he has experienced it up to this point being torn into shreds.
Mm.
And so part of what makes him great is that commitment. And that's part of what makes him capable of tragic recognition.
Mm.
Most other men, many other men in that circumstance would have stopped asking questions and dwelt in the false yet comforting and pleasing and flattering lie that has been their reality up to that point.
The autumnal light of their comfort.
And it's amazing that Jocasta, who somehow both plays the role of flattering wife and comforting, yet somehow too comforting mother to Oedipus, is the one who tries to insulate him in that lie. And when she sees that she won't be able to, and there's this wonderful moment right at the edge of the play where Oedipus knows he's about to find out what he's about to find out, and he says, I am on the edge of dreadful hearing. And then the person he's interrogating says, and I of dreadful speech. And then Oedipus says, and yet I must know. As if there's a point where that kind of dread of the thing, which is somehow the basic reality of your life, and the longing to confront it, become one in the single emotion. And that is something like the experience we have when we're watching a tragedy. We get a sense that we're trapped and the thing is
We've gotten on a
unfolding.
train and this train ain't stopping.
Yeah, and we don't want the next scene to happen, and yet we can't help but want to see the next scene happen. And this is somehow part of the tragic effect.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of, we've pushed this over the cliff. It's falling toward, the thing is falling. It's going to be a mighty crash. But we can't look away.
Yeah. And we can't look away in part because we suspect that the secret of our being is somehow about to be revealed.
Mm. Mm-hmm. That we're on the edge of something profound, even if in the revelation of that profound truth, all sorts of things get destroyed. Mm.
And
Maybe-
of course, I mean, if we're Christians, we think of all of history as leading to an apocalypse
Mhm.
in which everything that is hidden will be revealed and we will see the truth. And part of that apocalypse means the complete destruction and dissolution of the constituted, ordered world as we know it. And part of it also will mean confronting the deepest, darkest secret of who and what we really are.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, I think that what is noble in us, what is noble and doomed, we would say, from a tragic perspective, in us is like Oedipus, that we won't want to turn away in that moment. We will want to see the full truth at the cost of everything that we have understood or held dear and so forth. Even if we find out that somehow we have been complicit in ruining the most beautiful and ruining and marring the most beautiful and precious opportunities that God could have given us.
Mm. That we have, in our own way, burned Eden.
Right, right. And, we say this forever. When I am a sinner, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. But we rarely experience the full weight. We rarely begin to experience the full weight of what's bound up in that admission.
Mm.
And we want to. We are fated to, let me put it that way. And it would be better for us if we at some point desired that fate.
In a miniature way,
for it in a sense.
In a miniature way, isn't this what drives people into the ring, into races, into different competitions? I just think of guys going in to fight, all right, and they know they could get really messed up, right? But they want to know where they stand. They want to know who they are, right? And this is on a very physical level, but it touches upon, do I have the type of soul that can drive a body to victory, right? And so there's this way in which human beings are constantly forging ahead despite what the more nourishing, comforting, protective side of humanity might say, don't go there. It'll cost you. It'll cost you your life. It'll cost you everything.
That certainly
Yeah.
brings us back to the Iliad in a real way, I think, where
Achilles is challenged by
Achilles and actually all the great warriors,
Mhm.
Achaean and Trojan, have a desire to be in the realm of test, to find out what they're made of, and if they are made of manhood or not. And it's true that they're the kind of wonderfully in the Iliad. It's not like artillery or battle strategy that prevails in the end, but the individual courage of the splendid warrior who is capable of keeping his head in battle and plunging into danger that turns the tide of battle.
Mhm.
And so much of, I think that deep down in war, this is always true. But in so much of the kind of superstructure that modernity has built into war, we think it's all about these kind of impersonal, technological, and
geostrategic
things
positioning.
that somehow the the shape of lands and the shape of the world is created by some old men in a room moving cubes on a risk board,
Mhm.
if you will.
Mhm.
It's not true. Civilizations rise and fall on the courage of young men who want to find out what they're made of, even though it means risking everything.
Mhm.
And it will always be this way.
Right. Right. As long as human beings are human beings, right? Yeah. Huh. That would be fascinating. That would be a fascinating screenplay to write. A society that has robots so advanced that the robots could fight our wars for us. And yet civilizations would be like, nah, we'll fight our wars ourselves. That would be a fascinating screenplay to write.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Or a story. Right. Because I mean, that is certainly in certain corners of the robotic and AI intersection. Is couldn't we just make battle bots? Like, no, we have battle bots. No, 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 no. I'm talking real battle bots, right? I'm talking about, and this is what some people think is the future of warfare. But you're saying that there's always going to be this human desire to, I have to know everything about myself, or at least as much as I can. We see that everywhere from young men signing up to fight to stories of princes and thieves from what's that? Is that 7,000 years ago? No, no, no. 2,500 years ago. Saying I have to know. Um, um so again, just thinking about this idea of tragedy, I'm thinking of that last scene between uh in uh in the Iliad between Achilles and Priam, which is the correct pronunciation?
I'd say Priam. I think
Okay.
that's a little closer to the Greek, but Priam is perfectly acceptable.
Okay. And there's this moment in which Priam comes to collect his son's broken and desecrated body, right? And is it within this realm of the tragic that Achilles has his eyes opened a little bit to what he's destroyed? Or am I imagining that?
Yeah. I think Achilles has more than one moment of anagnorisis or recognition, though they're tied together, and each is more deep and comprehensive
Mm-hmm.
than the last.
Mm-hmm.
But for him, it's already beginning in book one, and you're right that what passes between Achilles and Priam in book 24 at the end of the epic is somehow fullest, the deepest, the most radiant, if you will. And I say radiant because in that moment, Priam looks on Achilles and, well, it's a series of recognitions, and so it's hard to talk about what's happening in the scene between Priam and Achilles unless you talk a little bit about Achilles and Patroclus. Because Patroclus enters battle in Achilles' place and wearing Achilles' arms and sort of blessed by Achilles to win the glory that he wants to win for himself, more or less for the motives that you were just talking about. Find out what he's made of, but also to save his brothers, the Achaeans, who are falling under the hands of manslaughtering Hector. And of course, Achilles has withdrawn from battle. And we haven't really talked about, it's hard to talk about what happens between Achilles and Patroclus until you have talked about just why Patroclus has to go in Achilles' place, because Achilles isn't going in Achilles' place, if you see what I mean. So
he's put himself on the bench.
Yes, he's put himself on the bench.
But he doesn't leave. For years I've thought, Achilles says, I don't want to play, but I'm going to stand next to the ball field and watch you guys play. And maybe you guys will invite me back, right? Right. He doesn't pack up and go home, which he was free to do. I mean, he was the prince of the Myrmidons, right? I mean, they were going to listen to him and leave if he said leave, but he doesn't leave. I mean, he's kind of leaving a hint that if my allies come back to me and say, hey, we've messed up, right? I mean, there is that hint in the fact that I
think he doesn't know what to do. I think so. Though that possibility is there.
Okay.
It's a possibility that the Achaeans up to book 9 are continually thinking about. Maybe we can persuade him to come back, or maybe he'll decide he'd prefer to come back. But the things that he says in book 9 to
the envoy,
the embassy who comes to persuade him to stay, Odysseus and Aias and Nestor, afterwards, when the lords meet in council, the princes meet in council, they say, the best thing we can do now is give hope on Achilles and find our own strength within us. So, but Achilles is staying. So, but again, so he leaves battle when Agamemnon dishonors him. Takes his token of his badge of his worth in the eyes of Agamemnon, the king who's leading the expedition, although Achilles himself is a king, so he's not like some underling to Agamemnon. He's a king who's following on Agamemnon's expedition. Agamemnon is a king leading an expedition who's asked for the help of other kings. He's a token of his value in the eyes of the king and in the eyes of the whole Achaean host. Briseis, the beautiful girl that they've captured from one of the cities allied to Troy. And at that moment, Achilles decides it's not worth fighting with this host.
They took his merit badge away.
And it's arguable. You might think that, well, really all he needs is his merit badge given back, maybe, or maybe his merit badge given back and 20 more merit badges. And Agamemnon offers him that in book 9 many, many times over. He says, I'll give you back the girl, promising that I never lay with her as is natural between men and women. And I'll give you 13 more girls. And I'll give you more treasures than are held inside of Egyptian Thebes. And when you return, I'll give you half my kingdom and my daughter's hand in marriage, and etc., etc., etc. A list of gifts and honors that no king has offered a warrior who's fighting next to him ever.
Still can't write a check though. It
Still
doesn't accept the check.
Yeah.
Can't cash the check.
Can't cash the check. Why not?
Yeah.
Why doesn't Achilles take it?
Right. Because it would be a clear signal that no, you are valued among the circle of peers.
Valued as no warrior in the host is valued. Valued as no king has valued.
Right.
A warrior who fights with him. Yes.
Yeah, I still wonder if even if you take the gift, there's still the signal of the high king giveth and the high king taketh away. The high king taketh away and the high king giveth, right? Like even if you accept the gift, you're still accepting it from someone who's able to give it. And that I wonder if even that creates a distinction between the two of you. Right. Ugh. It's a pretty big check, you know? Yeah, it's hard not to say yes.
And when Achilles ultimately does re-enter battle, though for other reasons, Agamemnon says, you should take all the gifts. And Achilles says, oh, sure, I'll take them, but let's talk about that later. It's not what he cares about.
No, it's not why I'm back. Yeah.
What he says in book 9 is, not all the treasure that was held in Troy in the days of its height is worth the value of my life. Those things can be won and they can be lost, but a man's life cannot come back again once it has slipped across the teeth's threshold.
Do you think the reason tragedy happens is because the hero doesn't face his fear? And that comedy is when he does? Like, if Hector would have just walked in one day to Paris and be like, bro, give the girl back now or I'm gonna whoop ya, it could have avoided a lot of problems. And they could have all gone home. Everything would have been okay. Helen would have to face Menelaus and be like, I really messed up. But, like, it's almost like they're all like, oh no, it's fine. And they have to fight to the death to prove themselves that he did an okay thing. But they're all proven wrong. Like Troy falls. Everyone that reads the book knows they did it wrong. Yet they're not willing to say we messed up and actually say we're sorry. And I wonder, I don't know what to carry it further with Oedipus. Maybe he should have asked Oracle, why is that my fate? Instead of just taking it as my fate and trying to run the other direction. Because if he had learned the reason why, maybe he would have understood the reasoning and maybe he would have made a different choice. Because it seems like in history a lot, it's always the I guess the warrior that when he's like, this is my fear, I'm gonna face it, and I know I have the chance to win, but it'd be worse to die not trying to face my fear than it would be to run away from it. Those are the ones we remember forever. Like it's like it's the Rocky story. he knows he's gonna get pummeled. He knows he's probably not gonna win, but he still goes in the ring.
That's Hector
Yeah.
in his last moment, and it is Achilles in the end. In fact,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I would have said, in tragedy, the hero faces his fear,
Mm.
but no man faces his fear without being trapped by it. In comedy, we don't have to face our ultimate fear.
Mm.
In comedy, we find a way together
Mm.
to evade it and to find happiness and fullness in this in between state where we're lucky to live.
So
In comedy, we find circumstances in which death itself has to stand aside for a little while longer, right?
Mhm.
The happy marriage, the happy circle of friends,
Mhm.
right? But I mean, you think about, is it a quote of Thomas More's in A Man for All Seasons, in which he tells his daughter, like, for all of our lives, death has only stood a little bit to one side, asking, is it perhaps not today the day in which all is brought to a close? Right? I think that's the correct gist of one of the later quotes in A Man for All Seasons. Um, that's interesting. So comedy, in a way, it's sort of, it reflects our hope of what might lie beyond, but at the same time is a putting aside the crossing of the Styx or the ascent to Calvary, right? It's putting off for some amount of time the thing that it takes ultimately to get to that which we hope for. So it's weird. It's both a realization of our final end, but also a putting off of a very necessary part of our journey.
And both, I think, both comedy and tragedy, they're artistic representations, artistic extensions, distortions of what we experience in life, so that comedy is it's and tragedy for the Greeks are rituals. We're trying to heighten and get into one of the deep realities of human existence and get into it together. Um, what we confront when we watch a tragedy is something, and what we confront when we witness the path of Achilles into death and loss is something that we have not yet experienced.
Mm-hmm.
They've gone farther into death and loss than we have. And certainly when you speak of Calvary, that's absolutely the case there.
Mm-hmm.
That we're kind of trying to, when we're meditating or reenacting or remembering the passion, we're trying to experience with the one who has experienced the rift at the heart of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And he's gone much farther into that rift
Mm-hmm.
than we can go. I would say that's true to a lesser degree,
Mm-hmm.
but still true of Oedipus and Achilles, that they have gone deeper into death and into the experience of death. They've been, in fact, the poet has so, and the gods have so constructed the universe to drive them deeper into that rift in the heart of the universe than we have gone. But it's good for us to try, in the kind of extended experience, the kind of transformed experience of literature or poetry, to go there with them. We can't and I would even go far as to say it's good to do so, because we can't really intimate the goodness of and the beauty of our world and the persons of our world unless we have a sense of that rift. We don't know how to love seriously until you understand, you begin to understand that experience of the thing that I just found out I love more than I love my own life is lost forever, and I'm somehow responsible.
I'm somehow the author of this.
Yeah. Without that experience, you can't love seriously enough the things that deserve to be loved. And you can't enjoy seriously enough. You can't enjoy the experience represented in comedy with the kind of fullness that you're supposed to, even. So I think of comedy and tragedy not as two like opposed visions of reality. And it's not as if I have to think that the world is comic or the world is tragic, but rather in order to understand, to enjoy the fullness and depth of comedy, I have to experience the fullness and depth of tragedy.
Right.
And the Greeks, who invented both these liturgical art forms, invented them together.
Right. Right. Yeah. We have to have a sense of what's at stake and what is lost and what we ourselves have been the cause of losing. We have to recognize the value of those things. And that to some degree is seen in comedy, right? When felicitous circumstances do arise, perhaps to some degree by our own authorship, but to some degree because the gods have smiled upon us. But we have to recognize what good this is, and it really is good. Yeah.
And I don't think it's an accident that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that in some way the penetrating, abysmal sorrow, but nevertheless a sorrow in which, over against which, the beauty and the potential goodness and nobility and of human life appears so radiantly. Without that reflection, he wouldn't have been able to write the comic epic, if you will, of the hero who fights to avert disaster and to restore
To restore the good which he left 10 years, 20 years before. Yeah. Right. To restore the happy circumstances.
and it's even possible to make the argument that Odysseus wouldn't have been the hero who was capable of doing that without having witnessed the splendor and depth and tragic destiny of Achilles.
Oh, interesting.
And of course, in the kind of one of the pivotal moments of the Odyssey, Odysseus goes into the underworld and he has an interview with the shade of Achilles. And it's at that moment that Odysseus is thinking he's going into the world of the dead, and he's reflecting on life and death, and he's finding the wisdom and the urgency to live out and make the most out of the life that is his. I don't think it's accidental that he encounters Achilles in that moment.
Right.
Though, I mean, I'm trying to make a different argument than one that I think is often made, which is that Achilles made all the mistakes. He wagered his life and lost his life and won immortal glory. And Odysseus got it right. He learned the lesson from Achilles' mistakes. I think it's something more profound than that.
People say that Achilles goes to war, dedicates himself to war, chooses war and the glory that can be won there over the possibility of having a family. Odysseus, in some way, turns his back on those things to go home. And you think that's sort of shallow to see it that way.
Well, so it certainly is true that what and uh, earlier you said Achilles benches himself, but
Mm-hmm.
he remains not too far from the field of action.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that he's asking, what? I'm going to die. And these are the things he's saying in book 9. Death comes for us all. It comes to the brave and it comes to the weakling. It comes to the one who fights hard and it comes to the one who hangs back. We're all held in a single honor, the cancellation of death. So he's asking, what kind of life, what kind of deed, what kind of future can I put in counterbalance to the death that's coming that would make it worth it? And he thinks about returning home.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when he's talking about the gifts that Agamemnon offers him, all those concubines and Agamemnon's own daughter for princess, whatever, he says, I could go home to Phthia and rule in my own acres
Mm-hmm.
and be honored among my people as a god and marry a girl and see my father grow old. And why shouldn't I do that? And then he also says, well, maybe when the fighting comes to my ship, I'll join the battle, even if I don't get any gifts. Maybe that would be the thing to do. But he doesn't know. He's reflecting on how should you live if you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the great question that young people, all people, need to ask themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of young people, Achilles is roughly 24 to 26 in the events of the the Iliad.
Trying to think how we can calculate his age.
Well, they've been fighting for 9 years. He was young enough to pass for a woman, so beardless when Odysseus found him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you figure he was 13, 14, maybe 15.
He could be 21, yeah.
He could, right. He could be even, yeah.
Yeah.
He could be even younger.
He he's called the shortest fated, swiftest fated, etc., etc. So yeah, he's and even Patroclus we tend to think of as younger than Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear from the text that he's sent by Achilles' father to be a kind of guardian for him, and he's older. He's a guardian figure for him. So, yeah.
The more I get, I need to work out. If he's crushing Greek army, like Trojan armies at 21, dang.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
back to the important.
You're right. He peaked in high school.
I think where I wanted to head with all of that was that it's precisely it was Achilles in book 9 who's looking for what would be of value in a human life that one could set against the loss of death that comes to take all, that would somehow make the transaction worth it. And the things that he's considering one of the things that he's considering is that life with his father and at home. And another thing that he's considering is imperishable glory. And he calls it imperishable glory, right? Where we're not talking about the kind of honors that a king can give or take away, that a people can give or take away, but the kind of showing forth of what something is that once it's seen, the cosmos cannot forget and cannot go without honor.
Mm.
It will be honored because, and therefore it's imperishable. So in any event, I think beginning already at book 9, but even more deeply when he loses Patroclus, the friend that who goes to fight in his place, and whom he discovers after he's lost him that he loves more than his own life, and in whose death he is profoundly implicated. That and then that he then finds something to die for, if you will, right? He's looking for a weight that will make death worth it. To die for his friend. It would have been worth it to fight and save his friend. The only thing that's worth it is to die for his friend and kill his friend's killer. And then what happens in that last scene in 24? It seems like with Priam, where he gives up his hatred of Hector and Hector's body. He seems to recognize in Priam's daring to walk into the presence of his man-slaughtering hand a courage.
This is the first time Priam has left the safety of the city.
Of the walls, yeah. Yeah. A man has got to find something that will call him outside the walls. And Hector goes out chasing a dream of glory, but Priam goes out.
That's interesting. I think that's
for his son, to hold him in his arms and to give him to his wife so that she can hold him in her arms and say goodbye to him. And that courage, that who else has gone up against Achilles? You can count them with one hand, the figures that dare to go up against Achilles. Priam is the last, and he goes up against him with no weapons at all, but with a courage that's grounded in the love of his son and the value that he sees in Hector's life. And Achilles sees in Priam's courage, and his courage grounded in love, the image of his own love for Patroclus. Sees, and in seeing himself in Priam is able to see Patroclus, the friend that he loves, in the enemy Hector that he hates most dearly. And they both weep together. And Achilles weeps for his father, his own father, whom he will not see grow old, and who will not hold Achilles' body in his hands. He weeps for his fathers who will lose him. That's what Achilles is doing, because he sees Priam weeping for his son whom he will lose, and he weeps for Patroclus, the friend that he loves more than his life, for whom he will give his life that he wouldn't give for all the treasure ever held in Troy. He sees that same love in Priam and what he's willing to risk for Patroclus, and therefore is capable of seeing, for risk for Hector, and therefore is capable of seeing in Hector his most hated enemy, someone, the likeness of his beloved friend, and to show him honor and to do him mercy. And in that moment, Homer says of Priam that he looked upon Achilles, and it seemed to him that Achilles was the outright vision of gods. This is the moment of Achilles' imperishable glory, when he is shining with the radiant image of divinity.
It's not on the battlefield. It's in a moment of what transfigures Achilles, so to speak, is not some accomplishment on the battlefield. It's knowledge of how things are beneath the surface.
Yes, it's the tragic recognition and the love and vision that is grounded in that tragic recognition that is his imperishable glory.
Wow. Yep. Definitely missed that on the first reading. But no, this is interesting. Just going back to Priam for a minute. I like that idea of he's helped. Priam has guarded the city in, as a king, maybe not physically, but he's maintained the city, right? He's helped build the walls in a certain sense. But then something causes him to leave it, and that reminds me of an image that Jordan Peterson gave in an interview one time when he said every person is called to those two steps in life. You have to do a thing which basically helps build the wall, right? That helps maintain order for your community, for your people against the outside force, right? You have to be part of the wall building effort. And that's good. And as Jordan Peterson says, that's not nothing, right? But then he goes on to say that and everyone should have a thing or a moment or a crisis in which they are personally called beyond the wall, right? They've helped build the wall, but then there's something that takes them away from that safety. Oh, and it seems that yes, Priam does in the end have to enact that twofold call.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And Priam is similarly a tragic figure.
Hmm.
Can't save his city anymore.
Uh-huh.
In that heroic capacity to go outside the wall shows the deep beauty and courage that was the heart of that city. And so in Lattimore's beautiful translation of the Iliad, he takes a little bit of liberty towards the end, and he says, of course, the very last line is, "Such was the burial of Hector, breaker of horses," but a little bit before that is something like, "And these were the funeral feasts held by Priam, king under God's hand," in which you get the sense of the hand of destruction coming down on Troy, but also the annihilating wave that's coming for Troy has also had the effect of awakening the tragic recognition and the tragic courage and the love that the tragic recognition makes possible in Troy's king, so that the city will die beautifully. And there's something amazing about the kind of, and this is, of course, the greatest tragic heroes die beautifully. And in a sense, the Iliad is all about dying beautifully. It's about, to quote now an Arbery, the terrible beauty of mortals confronting their mortality.
Hmm.
But in the kind of logic of sacrifice, right? When you burn something to the gods or to God, you take what is beautiful and what is never more beautiful than in the moment when it is burnt whole. Which is also, of course, how the warriors, the burial rites of warriors in the Iliad are done. And it's most memorable in the funeral pyre of Patroclus,
Mm-hmm.
but of course repeated in the funeral pyre of Hector, and you could say the Iliad itself. It doesn't include the funeral pyre of Achilles because in some sense it is the funeral pyre of Achilles. Something like that if you wanted.
What do you make of the fact that the story ends at the funeral of Achilles, and then
Funeral of Hector.
the funeral? Excuse me, sorry, the funeral of Hector, and then the conquering of Troy, right? That has apparently been attempted for 9 years, and it's going back and forth and back and forth, and thousands of people have died horribly bloody deaths, all for the sake of trying to conquer Troy. all of that is just mentioned, not exactly as an afterthought, but sort of in a retelling in another book by one witness, right? And it's not even really a battle, right? There's a little bit of fighting, but it's mostly the Greeks sneak in and mostly slaughter everybody, right? I mean, how do you how do you feel about the end of Troy not being a battle, but just being this basically special ops mission that then simply eviscerates the city? And there's no, and it's at night when when basically all the other battles have been during the day, right? It seems a bit anticlimactic for Troy as a city.
Yeah, it's the heroism of Odysseus
Mm.
that takes Troy,
Hmm.
which is a lot of prudence and cunning and disguise and black ops, as you say.
And readiness to put his money where his mouth is, right? He's in there in the horse.
He also gets um, the war. Well, Achilles will always, and men like Achilles will always be the image of the war. But
Mm-hmm.
it's another kind of man that gets it, that finishes it.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me. So you can think of. I don't know if you know this little. In a way, it's terribly appropriate that Troy is in this entirely fated state, yet entirely intact at the end of the Iliad,
Mm-hmm.
similar to Achilles, who has embraced the fact of his death, that it's right around the corner as far back as book 18, and is now relating to all his living affinities in a different way because he is somehow within his death. He's 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 surrounded by the death that is inevitable and imminent, but is still completely intact.
Mm-hmm.
And so the image of the city and the image of the warrior are both there.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think
Shining still for a brief moment.
right, and that's really what the Iliad is about. It's about the beauty of mortals confronting their mortality, as Troy and Achilles are both doing. It's we don't we've seen enough bodies cut up by the time you get to book 24 that there's not much left that we have to imagine. But there, I think there is also, I said earlier that the shape of lands in the earth will always depend on the venturing courage of young men who want to find out what they're made of and are willing to risk their lives to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's true. But it is, I want to give something back to the old men who play Risk too. That is, without such young men, you cannot fight or win a war. But without the wisdom and the counsel of strategists and old men, you can't finish them or construct a piece out of them. And Odysseus, um, I wouldn't call him an old man, but he's right midway through the journey of this life, shall we say. He's a young man who is going to be an old man and who's about to, and is uh, isn't going to die young and beautifully. Um, he's actually going to die peacefully in an old age, but he has the wisdom of old men, or is beginning to, in his finishing. Um, maybe not by the most beautiful means,
Mm-hmm.
but actually finishing the war
Hmm.
and with the stratagem of the horse and all of the black ops and so forth.
Yeah.
So
Greek Black Ops. That's the first instance.
and it might be, I mean, this I don't want to say that he has a comic contrivance because I don't think that's right to think of the fall of Troy in that way, and I don't think that's the way even the Odyssey thinks about the fall of Troy when Odysseus remembers it. A very interesting moment when he kind of relives the fall of Troy. But but you can kind of see the mind of the comic hero already at work. They're the one who is willing to work with disguises and deceptions and play the long game and project the plots of his mind forward, but then adjust them to what reality actually is to find a way to a happy outcome and to allow for um, divine blessings and good things to happen along the way and so forth that ultimately characterizes him by the end of the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
But I say, this the beauty of the young man venturing all. I mean, a good example of that is Yeats's poem, um, written in World War II. No, written between the wars about an Irish airman in World War One. And we think of World War One as um, the faceless war,
Mm.
the war in which really individual persons were
Eaten by the guns.
eaten by the guns. Yeah, canceled. What it was, you aren't one shining face and shining name after another as you are in the Iliad, where your father is remembered and your hometown is remembered. Rather, uh, you're all subjected to the equal honor of machine gun fire, and each is the same as the other.
You're all executed without discrimination.
Yeah, but Yeats wrote about that war a short poem for an Irish airman, and maybe I can recite it to conclude this episode. Or if we're at that point.
We are not.
We're not.
No.
Oh, no, we're just beginning. Well, I'll recite it.
But yeah, no, we'll recite it and then we'll take a break.
I might miss a line, but I'll find a way. An Irish airman foresees his death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan's cross. My countrymen, Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them richer than before. Nor love, nor duty bade me fight, nor public man, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight led to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The life before seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the life behind, in balance with this life, this death. And so you can see there's something Achillean about this young man.
Mm.
He isn't fighting for a cause, and he isn't fighting for hatred, and he isn't fighting for love. He's fighting because he's trying to find the most intense and beautiful form of life. And this is what brought Achilles to Troy, though he found before the end that love had something to do with it. And I think you can hear that a little bit in the Irish Airman as well when he says, my country is Kiltartan's cross. And he's talking about a little, little villages in Ireland. There's a crossroads and usually a stone cross there.
That's his world.
That's
Yeah.
these are my people. And it's similar with Achilles again, where he says, I'm from Thea. I don't have anything to do with you princes of Mycenae, Agamemnon, and Menelaus, and whether your wives happen to be taken from you. I came here to win glory.
Hmm.
So don't take my honor from me.
Mm.
I only have one life.
Mm. Whew. Take a quick break. And there you go. It's a sign from the Lord.
We're back.
Dr. Cooper, it turns out that our quick break will have to be considerably longer. You have to take off for the time being. I can only say that it's been an absolute pleasure to comic the Greek stories and the larger themes of heroism and honor that we've touched on here today. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. We could, if only we could do this all night long. I would love to. So
There will be other nights, and hopefully they are sooner rather than later. I'm sure they will be. Thanks again.
thank you, gentlemen.